Hey, this is David, pastor of Hamilton Life, and I want to thank you for taking a listen to our podcast. For more information on our church and how you can support the ministry, you can visit us online at hamiltonlifechurch.com. Thanks for taking a listen to the podcast, and we hope that God speaks to you directly through this message today.
I just want to thank you for being here, and I want to bring out my guest this morning. He's a counselor. He's my counselor. He's been here for over 10 years working in professional counseling. He's a licensed professional counselor. More than that, he's a husband and a father. And probably the coolest thing that you need to know about him is that he has actually invented a card game. And I no lie, we've played it. It's a blast. He's starting a Kickstarter to get it off the ground. You can find information at twostacks.com. This wasn't part of our agreement. He came regardless if I plugged his stuff or not. But you should check it out because it's fascinating. We've played the game, and I just think we love entrepreneurs and creators, don't we? Dreamers, creators, entrepreneurs are just fantastic. So I love when that ends up coming out. But I want to invite him, if you would give a warm welcome to Mr. Ed Doreau. Ed, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
And so I've known Ed for since January, I think. He and we've been seeing one another. I've been seeing him, and we've
strictly professional.
Yes, very strictly professional, and we've built up a rapport. And I told him a while back, I said, we are, as a church, considering starting this conversation about mental health. And so I ran my notes from last Sunday. If you didn't listen to the message, feel free to go back. That's not a self-promotion. I just think the information's worth hearing. Ran it by him, and I think he may have listened to the podcast. He said he did. I don't know. But I ran it by him, and then we started talking, and we just, what if we together just sort of address these issues, and we took up questions in the room, so I have here a stack of questions that have come in from you, and we're going to try to address as many as we can. I've also have a couple of podcasts that are up right now called Deeper, where I've talked with a couple of other people, and some of these questions have been answered through that. So if your question's not answered today, don't be offended. It was likely answered in a podcast, so go digging around. But I'm noticing that this conversation is big, and we're having it because we want to break the stigma. And so, Ed, I want to, again, thank you for doing this. And I introduced you, I know you heard, as a licensed counselor and a card game inventor. Is there anything else that people should know about you that maybe I don't?
That I'm human.
That you're human? That's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
Fair assessment. We're just going to dive right in for time's sake because I don't want us to lose track of time this morning, but also want us to dive in. We have a lot of questions to tackle. So I'm just going to jump right in, and we were addressed last week that over 25 million people are dealing with depression, 40 with anxiety just in America. So one of my questions that I think I have for you, and I think I'm even the one that wrote this, is what are some signs of anxiety and depression that you're noticing? Because I think for some people, we just assume that's not me. We have that sort of, I'm not depressed, or I'm not anxious, but yet maybe some of those signs are bubbling under. So explain that a little bit.
Yeah, to start with depression, the best way to characterize that is to say that struggling with depression is kind of like interacting with reality through a thick fog, where our emotional functionality, our ability to enjoy things even that just ought to be enjoyable, and our ability to experience motivation, it's just not there at the same level, to the point where reality just doesn't feel as real to us. Whereas anxiety, I mean, this is a bit of a simplification, is kind of like the opposite of that, where we almost feel like an exposed nerve. We feel hypersensitive, our mind is racing, and there's a lot of tension, physical and emotional. It's kind of like our mind is over-functioning in all the wrong ways.
Interesting. So someone who's maybe feeling hypersensitive, extra sort of, and maybe not normal for them because everyone feels things differently, maybe that's something they should look into. And of course, depression, I think that's one of those that typically go undiagnosed because we don't seek help, and all of a sudden we find ourselves maybe too deep to even recognize that we're depressed.
Yeah, and those two things are kind of like cousins to each other. It's not uncommon to find ourselves, going to one extreme and then the other, And so oftentimes anxiety and depression actually come hand in hand with each other.
So if somebody were experiencing maybe both of those, they shouldn't necessarily feel a lot of shame, like, oh man, I'm stacking up things on my list. They're hand in hand more often.
That's a human thing.
Yes. Which is a great way to put it, because I think all of the things that we've addressed the last couple of weeks and things we experience, we think we're the only person who feels this way. I'm the only person who's feeling sad. I can't shake out of it. I'm the only person who feels anxious, or, I'm the only person that's thoughts of suicide. We'll get to that in a little bit. And the reality is, and you addressed it accurately, we're human. These are human emotions that we have to harness.
Yeah, absolutely.
The second question that actually came in from the room, and I think this is fascinating. Keith Troop and I addressed this. Neither of us licensed professional counselors. We just play them on television. We addressed this in our podcast, but I wanted to address this with you as well. The question that came in from the room is depression hereditary? And anxiety too, really. We'll add to that.
The simple answer is yes, and it's for complex reasons. We could get into some of the research, but one thing that's worth noting right off the bat is parents who struggle with severe depression but do a poor job managing it tend to be neglectful of their children. And some of us grew up with that reality, and we know what that's like. And the thing is that kids who grow up feeling neglected are more likely to struggle with depression. So that's part of how the cycle repeats itself over and over again.
Where they feel that and experience it. And one of the things that Keith and I had talked about, and I don't know if he said this or I said this, it was brilliant, so I'll say I said this since I have a microphone, but I guess it really was me, so it was a brilliant thing I said. I likened it to the poverty cycle, where you kind of grow up in a poverty cycle and it's hard for you to break out of that. You're shaking your head, so I'm glad I'm doing this correctly, saying it right. Feel free to debunk that, but it's more like a poverty cycle where is it hereditary through DNA? Possibly, but more specifically, it's environmental more than anything.
Yeah, it actually varies from person to person. The reason we need to take the DNA portion of it seriously is there has been research where kids that are adopted at birth and are separated from their parents still end up sometimes exhibiting similar personality traits as the parent they never met, and sometimes experiencing similar mental health struggles as the parent they never met. And so to what degree nature versus nurture matters actually varies a lot on a case-by-case basis and on a matter of how severe matter of mental illness are we talking about. But one thing that can actually be very freeing with, giving DNA some credit or blame or whatever you want to call it for our problems is it helps us deal a bit better with the shame. There's a lot of shame with mental illness. A lot of I'm broken, I'm dumb, I'm bad, and the list goes on. And that's a very nasty self-repeating shame cycle that can keep worsening things inside of us. But if we can accept that literally some of our brokenness is written into our DNA, then we start to be able to say, okay, part of this is that I'm a broken person living in a broken world. Yeah. This is the hand I was dealt, and I just need to submit to God and learn to play this hand as well as possible, cope with this as well as I can. And it helps disarm some of the shame cycle, I think.
I wouldn't disagree, and I think it cuts both ways. I think it frees us from guilt and shame, but also a lot of times people use it as an excuse. Oh, it's just hereditary. I'm not going to mess with it. It's out of my control. I'm not going to fool with it. And so I think you have to walk that line, in my opinion, very closely to go, okay, we're going to recognize this so that we don't feel that shame and guilt and we get help, but we're also not going to use it as a crutch.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dialogue where the two sides, is this, a disease, or is it me? Is it something I have, or is it my sin? It's actually healthy to kind of engage with both of those in a give and take, because that's really kind of what it is. And it's a better way to approach treatment. And I find that people are more motivated to seek counseling when they say, wow, this is something that's just in me, something that I get to struggle with this as part of my sanctification. And I have to, sometimes as a matter of survival. I mean, depression can be classified as a life-threatening illness because sometimes it does end in suicide. And so the reality is how we manage the illness determines how we function relationally in life. How well we love our neighbors and receive love from them. And so, it's important to engage.
One of the things that we talked about last week in the message was body and soul. And a lot of times what I've noticed is that we'll treat the body or we'll treat the soul, and we don't necessarily treat both. And honestly, if you're dealing with something, you want to hit it with everything you can. And so I think looking at that both clinically and practically or environmentally and genetically is giving us a more holistic way to approach that. And that answers one of the questions that came in from the room was, is mental health due to environmental or genetics? So we addressed that for sure. The other question that came in the room is, what is the best way to show love to someone who's depressed? And I think we can broaden that too to say someone who's struggling with a mental illness, even though depression and anxiety have been the topic on the front end. What is the best way we show love to someone who's struggling with that?
Yeah, I give this exact same advice to people who say, how do I love someone who's struggling with grief, who's just lost a loved one? And the best advice I've ever heard, and the best advice I can give, is to be an optional presence to them. See, very often people who are struggling with depression or great loss in their life and despair, they're not as ready to relationally engage as we would like. You know, they're not ready to sit down and laugh and chum it up with us as much as we would normally like to engage relationally. And yet to withdraw from them, to say, oh, let's just give them some space. We do that too much. We're isolating the poor person. And that actually worsens their problem. So really, there's some healthy, in-betweens we can learn to say, hey, I'm going to come over and we can go for a walk. And it can just be a walk. We don't have to talk a lot, Or
it doesn't have to be about that. It can just be opening that conversation up. It helps sometimes. Takes the pressure.
Or for that matter, I'll come over. I'd love to hang out with you. But if you want to just throw a movie in, that's okay too. Because I get that sometimes togetherness needs to be just a real subtle, simple thing. And to be honest, sometimes that's the friend we all want to have. So do unto others as you would
being
have
them.
That friend.
Do
unto you.
I think a lot of times we think, well, if we know someone who's dealing with an issue surrounding mental health, we feel a little intimidated. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a professional. I don't want to mess things up. But just being, and we talked a little bit about this last week too, just being available, just being a friend, and you don't have to get into those. And you really shouldn't give advice. No one comes to you for help to get advice, not you. No one comes to us for help to get advice about how to live well. We come to one another for support and love and encouragement. And I think that's something you don't have to have a degree to do. You don't have to have a licensed counseling degree to be able to just show love and support. So I think that's very well put. And it's funny, while we were speaking, I got an alert to come see you tomorrow as a reminder, or Wednesday. So I just thought that was really ironic, if you will.
It'll be a great session. Yes,
unnecessary but ironic. We'll just call this our session. What are some steps that someone should take if they're dealing with anxiety or depression? What are some practical steps besides, or including seeing you, but what are some steps that someone should take if they think, hey, that might be me? Like that, you may not even say, hey, that's me. That might be me. Walk us through some of those steps.
As you said, I highly recommend going to see a counselor. I think counseling is at its best when it's preventative. I was going to say this later on, but it's kind of important to know if it's worth throwing it out there now. I think the most heartbreaking thing that happens with me in my profession is when people come in the aftermath of a divorce or severe addiction, and it has just torn their life apart. And I'm thinking to myself, man, I wish this person had come to me 5 years ago. We could have prevented a lot of this disaster, but instead we're stuck with using the counseling process to clean up the wreckage. And that's something I'm still happy to do with people, of course. That's not a bad reason to see a counselor by any means, but counseling works a lot better in terms of thinking about how we want to manage our future. We spend a lot of time in counseling talking about the past, not to dwell on it, but to learn from it. And to move into the future in as mature and equipped and spiritually appropriate and healthy way as possible.
I think that's important. I think it's vital because and it goes really with everything in our lives. We wait till our car breaks before we do the work. But if we did the regular maintenance on a vehicle, not that I do, but I know people who do, can do the regular maintenance and get us ready, it keeps the vehicle running more efficiently. I think for our bodies, we don't treat it that way. Even physically, we just sort of run ragged until finally we cannot stop and we're broke. And then we're trying to chase our tail. We're trying to play catch up. And so I think looking at, and we did this last week as well, drawn a strong parallel between mental and physical illness. We wouldn't ignore a broken leg, but we'll ignore these feelings of sadness. I think it's a good
great
advice.
Analogy.
Yeah, so go ahead and get on the front end, go ahead and get into counseling, get established with someone, build a rapport, even if you don't have an issue.
Yeah, and it's, of course, completely okay to just talk and vent to friends, too. There's an interesting question people come up with, at what point is talking with a friend not enough? Because that should be our first go-to. We should have people who love us enough that we can just say, man, I'm really struggling with something right now. And so then people say, well, why do I need a counselor? And it's the difference between saying, hey, I have a couch that I need to move. Can you come over and help me move it? And that's, of course, something, a decent friend, at least with a strong back, should be willing to do for you.
And a pickup.
Yeah, of course. But if you say, hey, I have a fancy grand piano that I need moved. A good friend's going to say, that sounds like a bit much. I feel like the most loving thing I can do for you is help you find a grand piano mover who can do that well for you. And so sometimes the best friend thing we can do to someone who comes to us with brokenness is say, can I help you pick a counselor? Can we look at some profiles online? Can we, sort this out together? Because I think this is more than I can adequately help you with.
And that's exactly what my role is here in a church in a more professional sense, is that I will help you move the small stuff and the light stuff. And then when it gets to a point, we refer, and I've referred to your organization multiple times. What impact does stress play on anxiety and really any mental health issue, but specifically anxiety? What role does stress play? I know this is one that I've dealt with personally. What role does stress play in that?
A big one, of course. Environment matters a lot, and that's why counseling matters, because we help people interact with how they can manage their stresses better. Where do they need to kind of retreat a little bit in life, and where they need to set better boundaries. And so it matters to a huge extent. And
sleep as well, I'm imagining.
Absolutely.
Speak to that just a little bit.
Yeah, I've had clients come to me for the first time in a severely sleep-deprived state, and I'm like, all right, for us to really be able to do this well, you need to get some sleep, and we need to have you talk with the doctor, do whatever you need to do about that, because sleep deprivation is kind of too real and too big a thing to just ignore it. So, yes, it definitely matters.
I think it's those practical things. Those are things we can manage, by and large. We can manage our stress by changing our lifestyle. We can manage our sleep, whether we need to see a doctor or set a better alarm or whatever.
Manageable and measurable.
Yeah.
It's a great way of measuring our progress. Well, how is your sleep doing? Are you able to make it through the night? Are you waking up, but it's fewer times than you used to wake up in the middle of the night? Racing thoughts still, but fewer than before. That's the kind of baby steps progress we typically see in the counseling.
And the other thing, and this was a question specifically, but to word it differently, the other thing that I've noticed that plays into this is physical activity and or exercise, and I've noticed the correlation. We all know that one friend who posts pictures of exercising at 5 a.m. We see you, Jade. You're working hard. We get it. She's in her nursery this morning. And we think, oh, man, whatever. And I've noticed that anybody who does not run or does not, go to the gym always feels like you're just showing off or you're just, whatever. But I've likened it to if I read a book and I can't put it down and it's impacted my life and it's changed me, I can't stop talking about it. I want to recommend it. And I think this is much the same way. I think there's a strong correlation between physical activity and even exercise, and I think it plays. Speak to that just a little. Kind of correlation.
There's real research to back up that exercise is a healthy.
Not just my opinion.
Yeah, a healthy way of coping with depression. And the truth is, we are connected beings. The spirit, the body, the mind. These aren't individual compartments. They all affect each other. And that sort of mind-soul-body interaction is something that modern medicine is just now starting to reasonably grapple with. It tried to deny it for a long time, to its own detriment. And it's, we're coming to an exciting time where people can talk about the holistic self and realize, this all matters. A healthy lifestyle matters. And, that's another thing that is manageable and measurable. Sometimes counsel certain people who come to see me, hey, let's talk about going for walks on a regular basis or the occasional jog or something like that is part of, what they need to be working on with their life. Certainly not the whole picture.
Again, looking at it as a holistic, shooting it at everything.
And there's no magic bullets. There are things that matter, but they're still just a small piece of the puzzle. Definitely.
But what I think what happens, and feel free to speak to this, I think what happens so many times is we get in this cycle of depression or anxiety where we don't feel like doing those things. We don't feel like going to sleep and sleeping well. We don't feel like exercising and walking. And so we sort of get overwhelmed. We get covered up to the point where we don't recognize our need to get that we're even in this kind of funk anymore. And so the thing that we need to help us get out of the thing, we don't recognize because we're so buried under the thing, right? No.
That's the spiral in a nutshell right there. And that's why it's healthy to ask for help. We can't white knuckle our way out of mental health struggles. And so, we all need a shoulder to lean on sometimes, whether that's a friend or a counselor. It is important to have accountability, have mutual encouragement, have healthy relationships, and, with that, a healthy counseling relationship once in a while, for sure.
And this wasn't, I think this is something I may have taken out, but I feel like it's important to address, especially with you here, because I know your answer already. but also have a strong opinion. What role does medicine play in that? Because I know there's a lot of stigma that surrounds medicine. We have a pharmacist here as part of our community, and he tells me all the time he feels more depression and anxiety medicine than anything else. And so we obviously know that there's an abundance of it. I know there's a lot of shame and guilt that come with that. Explain a little bit about your kind of take on medication.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one. I almost have to gauge it to who I'm reacting to based on who comes in my office, because we do live in a very, this sounds mean, but a very pill-happy culture where, at least in the secular world, people run to medication too easily, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a place at all. I have people come in on the other end of the spectrum saying, no, I won't touch it. And that's also a shame, because like we're connected beings, where that physical thing, that physical pill we can take in, can help us. And it's fair to say, hey, maybe it's like a crutch, right? Okay, so the medication is, the anti-anxiety is like a crutch, and a crutch is not a bad thing if you actually have a broken leg.
Yes.
The point is to wean yourself off of the crutch as your leg heals. And that's my favorite model for approaching medication. There are extreme cases where long-term heavier doses are necessary, but for most of us, it's a matter of saying, where am I at now? And can I talk with a prescriber? If necessary, usually talk with a counselor and friends first. And then, go to a prescriber and say, okay, this might be the kind of thing where I need a season as I'm trying to manage my life and make sense out of life. I need a crutch I can lean on for a bit until my leg mends, until I, work out certain things that are happening environmentally and relationally and make enough sense out of that where I can then safely wean myself off of the medication.
I think that's the important thing to emphasize is set a date. Hey, by this date, I want to reevaluate. I want to speak to my medical health, speak to my counselor,
Absolutely.
Reevaluate where we are. But set a goal, and in the process, this is just from personal experience, make sure you're doing the other stuff. Reading, listen to podcasts, getting with a counselor. You're actually doing the work and not allowing medicine to be that crutch for long term, unless there are long-term issues. The other thing I think is to bring someone that you trust in on that. So bring somebody that's close to you in on that and go, hey, I'm considering this medication. Hey, I'm considering this. If you notice signs, symptoms, and also more than anything, and my wife would speak to this more than I, is do your research. Because I've actually had a reaction to a medication that was scary. And I think it's very important that we understand how to take medicine, not just talking to your doctor, but actually doing some doctoring through the web. some self stuff. Yep.
You have to do a bit of both, because it's important not to treat your doctor like as a sovereign presence who knows all, because they don't. They're a broken, fallible person. It's also important not to dive too deep into the internet.
You have to be careful.
WebMD can convince everyone that they're dying of every horrible disease imaginable.
But knowing the history and medications and how to go off of them appropriately, how to take them appropriately, knowing people's personal experiences helps significantly.
Right.
And then if you ask for a medicine, they're going to give it to you. So be careful where you do. A question that came in the room as well is, I suffer from narcissism, which is an interesting...
That's a bold admission.
It's a very
Kudos
bold admission.
to whoever...
Could you stand and come join us here? I suffer from narcissism, and I need help genuinely loving people. What would you say to someone dealing with the issue of narcissism?
Honestly, if you're at the point of being self-aware about it, a group therapy process can be super helpful. I'm a huge fan of group therapy. It's one of my favorite things to do. And the neat thing is that the therapist is, just there to be like a cross between a tour guide and a referee, and a lot of the therapeutic process happens interpersonally. And what happens to the narcissistic individual, so long as it's not something that's dominating them to the point where they try to dominate the group, is they find this healthy interpersonal learning process, this safe, communal, confidential space where they get to engage in therapy but also engage in relationship. Group therapy is a great halfway in between individual therapy and just regular everyday relationships. And so that's where group therapy is really awesome, especially for somebody struggling with that.
And I think from the pastoral side, I think it's important to dive into community like this and give.
Absolutely.
Find a way to serve, find a way to give something. I think the more you give, the less you're looking to receive too.
Yeah, and that goes much broader than just narcissism. I counsel a lot of people. I'm blessed to work at a Christian practice, but we see a broad range of people. People have never been to church. People have been burned by church. People are still readily going to churches, but I try to meet people where they're at. And if people are, spiritually aware and ready to hear it, I do often encourage people, hey, you should go find a church, give a church a try, especially a small group.
Yes.
Do a bit of both, because the Christian faith is not meant to be lived out in, solo mode. It's not meant to be a one-on-one thing. It's meant to be a communal thing, and so that's an essential part of just living life.
Yeah.
I
the
think
tone changes just a little, and we become even more honest. What are some of the signs and also treatments for people who hurt themselves? This is an issue that goes largely unspoken. We don't talk about it. It goes ignored. Yet, even this weekend, I'd seen someone who had some scars on their arms. I'm assuming they didn't get attacked by barbed wire. I'm assuming there's something deeper happening. What are some signs of that, and also ways that maybe the individual could get treatment, but also people could help them get treatment?
Right. That's a great question that alludes to what I was talking about earlier when I said depression can be treated, should be regarded as a life-threatening disease.
Yeah.
And I would say that the signs of, other than the physical scars, are usually that the person does seem to be struggling with depression and withdrawing from relationships. Also, a telltale sign of people getting ready to attempt suicide is that they try to find their own subtle way to say goodbye to their loved ones, and that should be a big red flag for us, because depression is a scary thing, but suicide is not the answer. It's a permanent way to solve a temporary problem, and that's very unfortunate.
And that leads to the next two questions. I'll kind of lump them together because you'll probably want to address them in the same. Are having thoughts of suicide a sign of a deeper issue? And we know the answer is yes, but you can dive into that. And also, what should someone do when they have thoughts of suicide? Like, if you have that thought, even if it's small, what should someone do?
Yeah. Don't shame yourself. Know that it's more common than most people realize, but also talk to somebody about it. That's not a thought to just keep bottled up inside of yourself, or to ignore, or to deny.
Take lightly.
Right. That's something to sit down and talk with somebody who cares about you, and then go talk with a counselor about it, because it's probably one of those things where it's worth bringing it up in both spaces.
And so having thoughts of suicide are a sign of something deeper, and also they should be addressed appropriately. If someone were to come to you, I'm saying you to the broader sense, not you. If someone were to come to one of us with thoughts of suicide, how should someone address that? How should an average person address that?
First, just say, I'm so glad you're sharing this with me.
Yeah.
We have to learn not to lead with the shock response. Really? You? I never would have imagined. Or, oh my goodness, There's an impulse sometimes, if we're not experienced with interaction with deep emotional pain, to be a deer in the headlights. And we kind of have to learn to set that aside and just say, thank you so much for sharing this with me. That sort of thing can safely be the first words out of our mouths when somebody opens up about something as deep and hard as this.
It's hard to know how to respond. Mm-hmm. So that's a great way to just go, hey, I'm so sorry, let's, and then from there we kind of begin. I mean, I've personally think, and you can certainly add to this or change what I say, but I think also maybe trying to get with that person immediately, especially if it's in an imminent situation. Maybe take every issue serious.
Yeah. It's important to realize that even an inpatient stay for a few days, say at Park Ridge Valley or something like that, is still something that is typically kept confidential and something that is, again, more common than most people realize, and not something to be ashamed of. There's this nasty stigma around, especially around inpatient settings, that, that's when, you're
that's really bad.
Yeah, and the truth is I've had a lot of clients come out of such experiences and say, it was really just helpful. Mm-hmm. For me, it was really just a good space. It was a good wake-up call. I didn't love it there, which you shouldn't.
Right.
But it was a safe space to kind of step back and look at life a little bit more, and so that's definitely not something to be avoided.
And I think personally, from having had people come and contact me, hey, I'm having thoughts of hurting myself or suicide. We obviously, as a professional, we have, and teachers are the same way, have a responsibility to report that. And you're always clear in your sessions, hey, if you give me certain things are confidential, certain things aren't. But I think it's important that we're with that person and we get them help immediately, and then we help establish a rapport so that things don't spiral out of control. Go ahead. Did you want to add to that or no?
No, that was right on.
Yep. Can I still be a Christian? Another question. Can I still be a Christian if I have anxiety, depression, or thoughts of suicide?
Yeah, I would say that that it's almost hard to be a Christian and not have some struggles in life, because Christ commanded us to take up our cross and follow Him, and the scriptures talk about the Christian life as working out our salvation through fear and trembling. And there are also verses about, don't worry and cast all your cares upon God, as in don't obsess over worldly things to the point where they inform our emotions too much.
That's good.
Right? So it's important to take both into account. But being that Jesus himself declared that Satan is the prince of this world, this is a really broken world, and we are broken selves living in it. I'm deeply worried about anyone who seems overly polished, who says, "Oh,
they have it all together."
I just, life's just a cakewalk for
Right.
me," and I'm like, "Are you in league with the devil? How bad is this?"
I think it's sort of, and that was really the point of this conversation altogether, is just to debunk the mystery that I'm more broken than everyone else. I think part of the conversations I've had with people both inside this community and out is that once you start going, hey, I see a counselor, or hey, I've had thoughts that aren't positive, or I've felt funny, or whatever, people go, oh, me too. And all of a sudden you're like, well, why didn't we talk about this before? We're all broken. Why are we trying to pretend that we're not broken? And we don't, and we said this last week, we're not healthy people helping broken people, we're broken people helping broken people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you've even said in our times together that that's the way our relationship even is through the context of counseling, is broken helping broken.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, the best counselors, the ones who have examined themselves a lot. We analyze ourselves a lot more than our clients, and so that we can deal with where we're at in our journeys and kind of use that to best inform other people.
Another question that came in the room was, are certain mental disorders, are there certain mental disorders, I know how to read, are there certain mental disorders that make some people more likely to have addictions? And I think this is interesting, and you can maybe even draw a parallel to addictions and mental disorders and maybe see how that works together too.
Yes, absolutely. And there's also mental disorders that arise out of addiction, such that, I would say the majority of addiction that I've worked with, and I've worked with a lot, has been comorbid with some diagnosable mental illness, because if it's not causing the addiction, it's being caused by it. And it's also worth noting that some people are more genetically predisposed to addiction than others. And that's not by any means an excuse, but once they start to figure that out about themselves, that should be a call to action, a call to say, wow, I really just can't have a sip of alcohol. Wow. And that's the truth for some people, and other similar things. It's just like, what? For who I am, for the hand that I was dealt, I just need to, play life a little bit differently than some of my, other brothers and sisters in the church. Yeah. That's okay.
Yeah, and I think it's important to let other people know that too. Like, hey, I need to live a little different. And there's no shame in that. Certainly, no shame in that at all. That you're avoiding future problems or wrecking your life. Really. What are the other question? Another one that came in the room is, what are some practical ways to find self-worth? And this is pretty important, and maybe not directly tied to mental health, but I think it certainly ties.
Yeah. Come to church.
I plugged your card game, now you plug our church. That seems right.
This is a good cyclical relationship here.
Yeah.
I would say that in healthy relationship, primarily relationship with God and with one another, is the key place to find a sense of healthy sense of self, because I think in the secular culture, the concept of self-worth is too grounded in narcissism, too grounded in me.
Wow.
I think that's just not sustainable. Yeah. That's inherently self-destructive. That just kicks us into a weird narcissistic cycle. And it's so much healthier. And there's now even secular psychological research confirming that the quality of someone's life is predominantly determined by the quality of their relationships. If you want to know who's really happy, and through it all, is the people who both love and feel loved, encourage and feel encouraged, and do that with appropriate boundaries. So relationships are where it's at.
I think it's fantastic. Another question, really two, and they kind of piggyback. I think the answer will probably lead into the other, so I'll read them both. What is the best way to help someone get professional help? Can I make someone get help? So that's important. Piggybacking on that, what is the difference between being a loyal friend, relative, or spouse, and being an enabler or codependent?
Yeah. Ooh. To really dig deep into this question, I don't know how much time we have.
Yeah, you're fine. We've got a few. Yep.
It's so important in relationship and in life to understand the difference between hurting and harming, right? To hurt someone is to cause emotional pain. To harm is to cause damage. Wow. And not just physical damage, but the kind of long-term, trauma damage. In my profession and across medical professions, there's an essential ethic of first do no harm. But you won't find an ethic of first do no hurt, nor should there be one, because sometimes in order to help somebody, you have to hurt them. Sometimes, if somebody's struggling with an addiction, you have to sit down and have an intervention that's going to be awkward, that's going to, take their pride down a few notches, that's going to feel emotionally hurtful in some ways. There's going to be tears, at least if it's a good intervention, if it's an honest one, and so it is important, again, with appropriate guidance. We don't want to give ourselves too much license to hurt one another because that's its own pathology.
Don't want to mass friends and family in a living room and attack them when they come in.
Right. An intervention should not be an ambush.
Yes.
So, walking that line often requires professional guidance or pastoral guidance. But it is important to be willing to say, you know what, this is going to hurt and this is going to feel awkward and we're going to do it anyway, because to not do it would be to cause harm. Yeah. To ignore sin, to turn a blind eye to sin, is to harm.
That's good. There's a breaking eggs to make an omelet analogy in there somewhere, but I think the idea is, can you to answer the question, can you make someone get help? The answer probably is no, ultimately. However, making suggestions, making appointments, being willing to go with someone are probably all ways to help someone get help.
Yeah, and it's a question a lot of severity.
Yes.
How bad has the person's behavior gotten? How much is it affecting other people and affecting their relationships? Obviously, violent behavior or self-destructive behavior is the kind of thing where you jump in more seriously in how you go about encouraging the other person to seek help. But when it's a more modest thing, when you're just like, hey, man, I can tell that you're hurting, can we talk about this? One of the coolest things to do is, if you've ever had similar struggles at all or had to seek help, say, I went to see a counselor.
Yes.
Wow, man, that was really helpful to me. The key thing, in the non-severe interventions where you're just trying to encourage somebody who's hurting is to frame counseling as an opportunity rather than an obligation. The wrong message is, you're broken and this will fix you.
Yeah.
The right message is, you're hurting and this can be a safe space to experience some healing and some learning about how to navigate the future.
I think it's interesting that you brought it up. I didn't plan to address this, but there's the difference between non-severe and severe. If you're being abused, if someone's being abusive in any form of that word,
absolutely,
there should be a different
there should
approach.
Be consequences.
It shouldn't be taken lightly. We shouldn't go, hey, it's okay, let's go get some help together. It should be no, you need to get help. There may need to be a separation for a period of time, especially if it's spousal abuse, renewed, repetitive, alcohol, drug abuse. There has to be does come a point where you go, enough's enough, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think even as we as Christians are called to love one another, we, as God loves us, we have a then spiritual obligation to not engage in toxic relationship and to not enable toxic relationship. And so, good relationships consist of good boundaries.
And by staying is often condoning, by and large, especially if it's physically abusive.
Yeah.
It can be.
I've helped spouses navigate a structured separation. And, sometimes in severe situations, the three telltale signs where divorce is merited are adultery, are abuse, and abandonment.
Wow.
Severe abandonment, that is when the other person just disappears from the picture for a long period of time. And so there are times where I've even counseled towards a divorce, and that's a lot like, a doctor saying, well, we have to amputate a limb.
Wow.
It's not a go-to strategy by any means, but are there times where it's merited? Yeah, there are times where it's merited.
To save the body, you gotta,
Right.
And that's interesting. I've never really heard of that, but that's interesting. I'm not plotting or planning anything, Margie, but that's interesting. I've never heard of someone maybe navigating that through a counselor and maybe doing that to where everybody comes out at least as healthy as you can, because obviously that's a challenge.
Right.
Yeah, that's very helpful. The last question, it comes from the room, and it's a little bit lengthy, but I think it's very important. It says, I trust God to love and to help people I love, but I know it is, that's actually not the last question. I'm going to skip that one. If that was your question, it was fantastic. I'll read it later. This one is the one I wanted to close with. Well, and there's this too real quick. Sorry, there's so much. This is not our closing question. However, I think you'll answer it quickly. Is there a program to help students with mental illness?
If not, then there should be.
Yes.
I know the place where I work is also a graduate school that teaches students towards having a master's degree in counseling. And they have a program that makes it much more affordable for students.
They have interns, or they have people that are students themselves.
Yeah, well, and for our students, because counselors need counseling sometimes. If they tell you otherwise, they're wrong. For our students, and we have at our center, the phone number you'll get on my card will get you to our front desk, and we have interns who can see people for next to nothing. And they're still good counselors. So by all means, even if you're a student or just somebody struggling with poverty, please don't.
So they help students, not even just students at that school. They help students at large. Or is it specific at that school?
Our students can see
Okay.
counselors in our center or in other centers affiliated with
Okay.
us.
And that's Henninger. Did I say that correctly?
Henninger.
I said it wrong, and I'll say it. And there are cards at the info table on the way out with his specific information, but also Henninger's. The last question, and the question I skipped was related to the others, so I didn't skip your question. And this is summarized. I think this is really important for us to close on. Many of my friends and family members struggle with various mental health disorders, and I suffer from severe mood swings and depression, but was healed. I feel guilty and overwhelmed. Why was prayer enough for me and not them? Why did God heal me? And I think that's important. Address that as much as you'd like, and then I'll also have a little bit, and then we'll close.
Yeah, it sounds like there might be some survivor's guilt there,
Sure.
but I think it's important to, when we see other people who are struggling and wondering why they're still struggling, not to say God hasn't healed them, but he hasn't healed them yet.
That's good.
So maintain healthy hope for the future in the midst of that. And also, sometimes I think God blesses us so that we can bless others.
Yeah, that's good.
God heals us so that we can engage in healing with others. And if you're someone who, say, came from a dysfunctional family and went through, kind of a healing process and wants to know how best to go back and, interact with your family in a way that's healthy for you and for them, that's definitely something to talk to a counselor about, because that process could also derail you back into a sense of depression yourself. And so it'd be really healthy. And I've helped people navigate a lot of difficult relational trauma in my practice. And it's very important to talk about that.
But survivor's guilt is a very real thing, and I think it's important to note that being healed or being well is not a right, it's a responsibility.
Yeah.
And I've found that play out in my own life, where once I got to a place of health physically, it wasn't just for me to go celebrate my health, but now it's a time to turn around and help people who aren't healthy. And so I think that's important. I think it's a fantastic question. Really quickly, because we have about 2 minutes, is there a question that's pressing in the room really quickly that somebody just wants to know the answer to before we close? And you don't have to come up with anything, because I can keep talking. But does anybody have a thing they want to close with? Just throw your hand up. Any question that's pressing? Okay, fantastic. Speak now, forever hold your peace. Go ahead, Jared.
I can see now this can be like more context. Maybe one a lot like 30 minutes.
We'll just come back next week and just be Jared. Yep.
So I can recognize now over the majority of my life I've had depression. But being an adult, I kind of was like a really good kid and a terrible adult. That's how I like to say it. So my question is, having been a high achiever at a younger age and now seeing that, how do you manage the expectation of coming like, I know I have, I know how it affects me? How do you try to manage that?
Yeah, speaking as someone who's went through something a little bit similar, being a high achiever and then struggling with some depression later in life, I would say that sometimes we have to look back and realize in some ways we grew up too quickly. As children, we never really question what we're given. Even kids who grew up in a war zone just kind of accept the war zone as their normal because it's what they're given as normalcy. And so we learn to just adapt, and we can be high achievers as kids. And sometimes that's dangerous because we think we've got it all put together as a high achiever, and it's not until later that we're like, wait a second, I was really relationally deprived, I was really hurting, I was really lonely, and I was just trying to cope with it by looking for meaning and self-worth through achievement. I know that was part of my story.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good. Thanks for stepping in there. Let's close in prayer. Ed, I want to thank you for joining us. Can we give Ed a hand clap really quickly? He's given us his time.
For more information on our church and how you can support the ministry, you can visit us online at hamiltonlifechurch.com.